like to compare the Watchmen with the the Frankenstein.
Frankenstein. Okay.
Um, the Doctor Frankenstein, he created the monster,
Hmm.
and the reason he created it is he want to be very famous. He want to as a go to create him,
Okay.
and I would like to is this very similar to the Doctor Manhattan. They has some relationship with.
Well, I don't know because Dr. Manhattan wanted to be human because he was more than. He was trying to find a way to connect and identify with humans, whereas Dr. Frankenstein wanted to create life. He wanted to become God. So he was actually kind of going in the opposite direction of what Dr. Manhattan was doing. So Dr. Manhattan was a god who wanted to be more human, whereas Frankenstein was a human who wanted to play God, right? So I guess that's the only connection is the fact that they're kind of going in opposite directions. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and uh, is there any other relationship like the Arrow created the superheroes and then um, abandoned them, and the Doctor Frankenstein he created the master, but again abandoned him.
Mm, well, I don't remember how much I remember about the story of Frankenstein, but it was. I remember the people turning against the creation of the monster, um, but I can't remember if Frankenstein actually abandoned the monster or not, so I don't really know. But in Watchmen, yeah, it was as because they started out as people who worked for the government. When the government realized that they probably couldn't continue to control them, that's when they started to break away, right? Because if you can't control them, you need to make them like villains, make them a target, right? And you see that a lot in politics when a government can't control something, they're like, well, that's now the bad guy, and I think that's what happened there. So it was very much like that. But I can't remember enough about Frankenstein if the doctor did the same thing to him or not. But yeah, there was certainly once the government made the Watchmen more villains. Well, initially the Minutemen who became the Watchmen. Once they made them villains instead of heroes, then the people turned against them, and then you get the very same comparison where the Watchmen are Frankenstein and the angry mob comes after them to get rid of them. So yeah, so there's some parallels there for sure. There's very little about the Watchmen that's really very original. Um, I think it's one of those books that gets a lot more credit and a lot more attention than it really deserves. But I mean, it's a good and interesting piece, but it's certainly not very original. It borrows from a lot of things, and even the heroes themselves are not original heroes. They're all taken from somewhere else.
Oh
Yeah, so yeah, it's pretty interesting to extract. Um, instead of creating something new, Alan Moore took something that already existed just so that he could tear it down, right? But that's the way it goes, and a lot of times there's not a lot of original ideas left. So
yeah, and another question is, I searched online. The author said the purpose, the superheroes in the Watchmen is not the new, but the constructing the hero.
deconstructing the heroes. Yep.
Deconstructing the hero. It's that he mean that this can be connection with the like American the individual culture, like before superhero can do everything by himself.
Mm-hmm.
Only one can save the world. But now this idea does not suit the society.
Well, you have to remember that the story was written in the very early 1980s.
Oh yeah.
So it was a much different time.
Oh yeah.
And at that point, you've had almost 50 years worth of comic books, but heroes are always shown in a particular light. So Alan Moore wanted to kind of break that down and show people that heroes aren't always pure and good and all that. And it was very much to do something very different than what was already there, while also reflecting upon that was how the world was changing, that things that always seemed good weren't necessarily always good, or people that were trying to do what was right weren't necessarily doing the best thing for people. They were trying to get to a point, but they didn't always do it the best way or the cleanest way or the safest way. So a lot of times it was do things whatever it takes to get done. And so I think that was very much Alan Moore trying to say that this is the way the world is now. And so that was the story he was trying to change how we looked at comics, and he was also changing what we thought of superheroes, and we could see them as flawed and broken, but it's a lot of his work tends to reflect what is happening in the world at that time.
Yes. Okay. So does that mean superheroes like take off their masks or their clothing, they will become common people. So they will also be judged. So let them to judge the people if he or she is good or bad is not kind of correct. Because the superheroes will also be made mistakes.
Yeah, and that was a big part, but I think there's also nowadays, now that we've come almost 30 years past, a lot of books are trying to change that so that it's not quite so dark, because you want heroes to be noble and you want them to be bright and shiny because they're supposed to represent the best. If all your heroes are flawed and broken and doing terrible things, even for good reasons, there's not much to look up to. So there has come around a bit more where the heroes are kind of becoming a bit more traditional, where they go back to the masks and they keep their private lives private, but they go out and do the good deeds as best they can. They can still make mistakes, but they're not mistakes that are made with bad intent, which was what happened in the Watchmen, right?
Yes.
They would, I'm going to save the world, but I don't care who I hurt going along, or I don't care if I break the law, or I don't care if I hurt somebody. So it's much different. So there's a return to the more traditional idea of what a hero is.
Oh yeah.
And what they should be.
Oh yeah. So but it are different with legend and heroes. Legend.
Is it different?
Yeah.
Well, no, because all modern heroes come from legends and folklore, and if you trace back far enough, everything is influenced by something. Everything comes from somewhere, and that comes from somewhere, and it goes back further and further. So, Batman was not an original idea by any means. It was just kind of an adaptation of other characters who existed, taking bits and pieces and then creating this new hero, and then stepping it up a bit more to make them more of the